This is the country that sent the first man to space. This is the country that made the first communist state. This is the country that defied Napoleon and Hitler. This is the country with the biggest territory in the world, and yet it used to be even bigger. This is the country that gave America a run for its money and ruthlessly fought for the position of world superpower, with nations scrambling to pick the right side. 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia is making an unforgettable revival from its deep slumber to send shockwaves against the established world order once again. If anything, Russia is even more aggressive than the Soviets were during the Cold War, letting its assertive military campaigns do the talking. Most recently, Russia shocked the world by commencing a blatant invasion of Ukraine, steering long-forgotten fears of a nuclear apocalypse. Before we begin, we would like to make it clear that we do not support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that we at Knowledge Raiders wish for peace and stability to return to the region. Why can't Russia resist invading its neighboring nations? We're going to explore the fundamental, geopolitical, and historical reason behind why Russia can't chill out. Let's set sail to Russia, the traumatized, brutal bully. Russia is such an incomprehensibly huge country. However, Russia's actual main base is only about yay big, built around Moscow with St. Petersburg to the north and the Volga River to the south. This was a beating heart of the empire known as European Russia. Why was Russia's capital located in this cold, desolate region instead of the less hyperthermic and significantly nicer south? Truth be told, the Russians didn't want to live in this hostile environment either. Let's go back several centuries in Russian history, back when the Rus civilization was based around the Dnieper River instead of the Volga River. After the mass migration of the Germanic tribes, the East Slavic tribes started several duchies. Kyiv, the current capital of Ukraine, was the most powerful back in the day due to its abnormally fertile wheat farmland and free access to the Black Sea. As an early adopter of the religion and culture of Eastern Europe, Kyiv built a titanic trade network stretching from Northern Europe to Persia. The Grand Principality of Kyiv was a shining bastion of civilization from the 9th century to the 13th century. Unfortunately, the inevitable Mongol Empire vaporized them along the other East Slavic duchies that dared to stand in their mission of making the medieval world perfectly balanced, as all things should be. The proud people of Kyiv were forced to humiliatingly bend the knee under the rule of the Mongolian Golden Horde. Somewhat thankfully, the Golden Horde only cared about the southern regions like Kyiv and neglected the cold and impoverished northern regions, like alcoholic trailer trash parents. Moscow was a child that ran away from this broken home at the first opportunity. The Golden Horde offered Moscow protection and acknowledged it as an independent duchy while collecting a generous tax for its services. Ironically, this actually worked out, and Moscow soared as the vibrant heart of the East Slav culture, patiently preparing for the day for them to overthrow their Mongol overlords. Moscow slowly funded their one chance of rebellion with siphoned funds over 200 years. One day at the end of the 15th century, as the Golden Horde started their descent into oblivion, it was finally time for the slow knife that waited years without forgetting to take their deep revenge. The Moscow Duchy united the East Slav people and unleashed generations of fury upon the south. The heavens smiled upon them that day as the Eastern Roman Empire finally fell to the Ottoman Empire. At this exact time, the Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, couldn't have found a better time to slide into the DMs of the last princess of the once mighty Roman Empire. I assume that losing an empire of 1,000 years lowered her self-esteem a tiny bit because she married him, and Moscow announced itself as a third Rome and protector of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Once the Grand Duke of Moscow, and now the mighty Tsar ruling over all the East Slavs, this is where the country we now know as Russia begins. Russia then swiftly retook the Ukrainian area, snowballing into an unstoppable force. They expanded all the way to the Caucasus Mountains and the Ural Mountains by the end of the 16th century. By the end of the 17th century, they claimed the entirety of Siberia and expanded all the way to China. The Russians cleared a path to the ocean by recapturing the Baltic Sea from Sweden. Unfortunately, Russia wasn't the only strong kid on the block. The nomads to the east were thoroughly eviscerated for the humiliating past, but the Western powers were getting too strong for comfort. Let's examine the geography of this region, shall we? Europe is an absolute nightmare of a region to invade, with an abundance of horrendous obstacles like the Pyrenees, Alps, and Carpathian Mountains, along with the cancerous shorelines, just making life absolutely miserable. This region was never unified since the Roman Empire, not even by the fierce nomadic tribes. Let's now take a look at Russia's main base. It's about as flat as your mother... You know what? I am not gonna go there. The vast plains are a perfect place to quickly break ground on horseback or tanks. In fact, the nomads would just quickly zoom through this region to attack the west, leaving nothing but death and destruction for Russia. The other European nations only had a chance of stopping the seasonal waves of violent nomads by camping the natural obstacles in Hungary or Poland. Russia learned this painful lesson all too well during the 200 years of Mongolian rule. That's why the first thing they did after seizing power was to initiate a brutal, relentless crusade towards the east and south to give themselves a safe space. Now, Russia only had to contend with growing rival powers in the west. There were three main paths that potential invaders could cruise through. The first path, the one closest to Moscow, was by far the easiest to deal with. So, Peter the Great just created a new capital called, you guessed it, St. Petersburg. Then, he conquered the Baltic region and used them as an inconvenient buffer against the potential invasions. Its modern-day equivalent would be Bill Gates purchasing an entire neighborhood so the fucking hippies would stay off his lawn. The next path is significantly more threatening. These Great Plains, an invader's delight, start from the Ural Mountains, pass through northern Europe, and extend all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. To make matters worse, the strong nations of Russia, Poland, Germany, and France are all engaged in an uncomfortable standoff along this path. If one of these countries goes complete Hitler and suddenly raises a strong military, these plains serve as a smooth, convenient, natural highway to Moscow for the invaders. The final path is a bit better with some natural obstacles, but it has a series of unfriendly nations lurking behind it. The fertile farmlands of Ukraine give way to the Balkans and the Black Sea. The Austrians are right there, just behind the Carpathian Mountains, while the Ottoman Empire is another headache across the Black Sea. Russia felt terribly vulnerable about the second path without any natural obstacles present to slow down a military from, let's say, steamrolling Moscow and St. Petersburg. Just like it did with the threats to the east, it took the wisdom, the best defense is a good offense, to heart, and attack the west. Starting from the Baltic region, the unstoppable Russian war machine kept advancing westward during the entirety of the 18th century. It cucked the Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire, then borrowed one-third of Polish territory while steadily pushing west. Ironically, this act of self-defense aggroed the major European nations, who now considered Russia a potential threat to be dealt with. Because of this, whenever a particularly strong military emerges from the crucible of a bloody European war, it says, fuck it, might as well conquer Moscow. The first country to put Russia back in its place is France, led by the mighty Napoleon. He couldn't conquer England despite his best efforts, so, fuck it, might as well conquer Moscow. Napoleon brings the full might of the French army on a powerful campaign to finally bring the arrogant Russians to heel. The French completely overwhelmed the Russians and capture Moscow with relative ease. But the Russians have a secret weapon up their sleeve: winter. Mercilessly teabagged by hyperthermia and harassed by guerrilla warfare, the French retreat in an epic fail. About 100 years later, it's Germany's time at bat. Fuck it, might as well conquer Moscow. Unfortunately, having to deal with the Russian Revolution at home kept the Russians too busy to put up a proper fight. They hastily agreed to a humiliating treaty and were forced to hand over the western buffer regions that they painstakingly captured over hundreds of years. Not too long after, Germany spawns Hitler's Third Reich and torches Europe. In the beginning, the now Soviet Union did have a non-aggression pact with Germany. Despite Hitler's best attempts, he just couldn't kill off England just like Napoleon before him. Well, you know how this goes. Fuck it, might as well conquer Moscow. Germany goes balls deep into Russia. Operation Barbarossa initiated the most horrific war in the entirety of World War II. Germany massacred the Soviet forces everywhere in a cruel rampage. The Battle of Stalingrad miraculously turned the tides of war, and the Soviets eagerly pressed the attack. Finally enacting a long-awaited vengeance, they conquered Berlin, the capital of Germany, and rose to claim the throne as a world superpower. Mother Russia never forgets its painful lessons. It was brought to its knees by the nomads from the east in the medieval era, and excruciatingly harassed by the European powers in the west in the modern era. Oh, they're traumatized to hell, and paranoid as fuck at this point. It's not getting any better. There's this random country across the ocean called America that is leading the Western European countries in an attempt to fend off this blatantly overpowered superpower. The Soviet Union feels a compulsive urge to extend its borders beyond anything it's ever imagined. First, they reconquer the lost territory of the old Russian Empire as a final line of defense. This constitutes of the Baltic nations, Belarus, and Ukraine to the west, all the way to the Caucasus Mountains, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to the south. All those confusing Central Asian countries that end with something something Stan? Yeah, they were all directly recruited into the Soviet Union for this purpose. This isn't enough for the traumatized Soviets. They established a second line of defense by ruthlessly forcing the creation of communist puppet governments as satellite nations in Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Albania in Europe, as well as Mongolia and North Korea in Asia, were seduced into communism. The Russian people have a long memory, and this still isn't enough. As the first line of defense against the Western powers, the Soviet Union props up East Germany with the Berlin Wall, leaving a communist nation right up against the free world as a canary against democracy. America and the Soviet Union split the world in two after World War II. America and the Western First World created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and started to strangle out communism. To further keep the Soviet Union in check, America placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey. This really didn't help with the Soviet Union's PTSD. The Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in direct retaliation to NATO, and attempted to place their own nuclear missiles in Cuba in direct retaliation to the Jupiter missiles, which almost started a nuclear holocaust. A secret quid pro quo with JFK de-escalated the crisis, and the nuclear missiles were removed from both sides. The Warsaw Pact was, in essence, used to crush internal rebellions in satellite states instead of waging external wars against other NATO countries. In fact, the Soviet Union was able to avoid direct military conflict for the most part and had a surprisingly peaceful time. This was all because the Soviets had large buffers between them and their potential threats. They had enough space to maneuver around without having to lash out with their PTSD nukes. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and everything goes downhill from there. Utter governmental confusion and economy shot to shit, and members of the Soviet Union hysterically screaming for independence was just the beginning. Russia ended up with less land than it had after the First World War. As far as buffers against Western threats go, Russia was sent straight back to the medieval age, back to its humble beginnings as a duchy. Russia suddenly felt very vulnerable and paranoid in the wide open plains once again. While immediate buffer states like Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan stayed somewhat friendly to Russia because of their significant Russian population and common ground, countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Armenia, and the Baltic countries became outright hostile due to the transgressions Russia committed against them throughout history. Russia's first and second lines of defense evaporated overnight, and it only had a sad fraction of its final line of defense. To make Russia's paranoia even worse, Western countries decided to use this crisis to expand NATO further east. The lines of defense so meticulously established during the Soviet days were now threats aimed straight back at Russia. Specifically, East Germany, a key pillar of the Warsaw Pact, was now turned into a NATO country, as well as other pillar countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. This path was now wide open and hostile. After the 2000s, Romania, Bulgaria, and even the Baltic countries were all hostile to Russia. The paths that Russia so desperately cleared for a safe space were no longer safe. Within 30 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, all their efforts were simply undone with a single snap. I understand that Putin is probably the world's most hated person as of March 2022, and rightfully so. But he does deserve some credit for attempting to restore good relations with the Western world back in the day as soon as he took power, while stabilizing the regime and rebuilding Russia's economy. He proactively cooperated with the United States during the Afghanistan invasion by handing over confidential information in an attempt to restore good relations. Believe it or not, he even formally requested to be a member of NATO. The Western world, spitting in the face of these gestures of good faith, was Nothing but insulting from Russia's point of view. The anti-American sentiment only gets worse in Russia. Putin has to satisfy his constituents and becomes more of a bully. America hates Russia and imposes more sanctions, and the ear-splitting feedback loop only gets worse. Currently, the anti-American sentiment in Russia is worse than it was during the heights of the Cold War, when the world was an inch away from nuclear Armageddon. Russia is a claustrophobic superpower with a terrible case of PTSD and a nuclear arsenal that'll do anything in its power to protect its final line of defense as the walls keep closing in. Lashing out with concerning volatility, Russia is getting increasingly reckless from the Chechen War in the 1990s, the Russo-Georgian War in the 2000s, the Crimean crisis in the 2010s, and finally, the invasion of Ukraine in the 2020s. We at Knowledge Raiders would like to, again, make absolutely clear that we do not support the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the heinous war crimes. Our hearts go out to the victims of this horrific war, and we wish for peace to be restored in the region. However, we believe it's important to understand the specific circumstances and motivations behind this invasion from a geopolitical and historical standpoint instead of a convenient Putin is just evil. Russia believes that once Ukraine falls, it's Belarus and Kazakhstan next, and then the enemy is knocking on the door. A NATO Ukraine provokes the same emotional distress to Russia as a Russian Mexico armed with nuclear weapons would to America. We're not saying that this is justified, but just like how facts may not care about feelings, feelings like paranoia tend to not give a flying fuck about facts either. This has been David Bradford from Knowledge Raiders, and thank you for watching.